Chapter 6. Count Conradin von Buchhorn. The travelers rode south out of Ostrach. This morning was different than the one before. The slaps on the back and shoulders that the knights had been giving each other during the voyage were passed along to Vicarus's back and shoulders. There was an obvious air of mutual respect about them all, not due to Vicarus's ancient lineage, not from anything inherited from his father, but from his voice, something that was his alone to offer to any ear in need of it, any spirit able to be satiated by its soothing waters. His curt and timid contributions to the conversations of the previous afternoon were much more earnestly appreciated than Vicarus knew. He wasted no time on the third day of travel. He sang the sun out of its hiding and into the sky. The first beams of the soft morning light hit Vicarus directly on his singing tongue, appearing to him and to the knights as if the sun itself sought healing from his prayerful songs. The day passed in conversation and song, excluding from this, of course, the priest, whose thoughts were impossible for Vicarus to guess. Surprisingly, before Vicarus had the first thought of a walk and a stretch, the priest stopped the cart and invited the others to dismount for a rest. He was the first off of the cart, and he knelt for prayer exactly as Vicarus had found him the day before. The knights smiled at each other, then to Vicarus, and followed in kind, again leaving a space for the boy. Vicarus took the hint. He knew what the priest wanted, what he needed. Vicarus knelt in his designated place and led the chant. Again the others placed their voices on Vicarus's, to be taken on that divine chariot to their destination among the clouds. During the song, Vicarus opened his eyes and watched the others as they sang together. The knights held expressions of calmness on their faces, as if sleeping with their mouths in motion. The priest looked like a different human being entirely. A softness settled over his harsh face. His wrinkles no longer spoke of repudiation and dismissal, but of understanding, of countless years filled with endless experiences, all in service to something larger than what saw the light of the sun that morning. Vicarus was enchanted by this new vision of the priest, and he wondered why he was unable to see the man in that light before. Such rich and pure devotion, such zealous commitment swam through the trenches of those deep facial wrinkles. From that point, Vicarus had no fear of the priest, only admiration. The scowl was a battle scar of a life that did more and witnessed more than even Vicarus's wild imagination could frame. After the prayerful pause, they set back to motion. But this time, Vicarus sat beside the priest. Nothing was said between them. There were no words of welcome or encouragement inviting Vicarus to remain hip to hip, but there was not the slightest hint of rejection either. The two of them looked straight ahead, while the knights took advantage of the extra room in the back to stretch themselves out and fall asleep. Vicarus was not pressed against the priest as tightly as he had been in that tiny bed at Ulm, but what contact they had was of a very different nature. There was something alluring in Vicarus's connection to the priest, something to be gained by the alliance that might rub from one shoulder to another. The previous day's travel was brisk and with purpose. Vicarus did not understand the necessity of expedience, but imagined that the constant flick of the whip, squeezed tightly in the priest's hand, that prodded the horses into their pace must have had its reasons. But the third day was different. An altered air surrounding the cart lulled the travelers and the horses into greater leisure. Vicarus could not imagine what might have transpired to so drastically reduce their need for fleetness. He relished an atmosphere much nearer that of his home, and allowed himself to drift in and out of nostalgic trances, featuring the smells, tastes, sounds, and warm embraces he had known in the castle. The voyage from Ostrach to the shore of Lake Constance would have taken half a day at their previous pace. The cart carrying Vicarus and his fellow travelers exhausted the length of the day before the battlements of Meersburg Castle dominated the southern horizon in front of them. Once the lakeside castle was in sight, the road seemed to straighten, as if its attention to its destiny had been focused by the revelation of the grey stone walls and pointed peaks of Meersburg's most prominent feature. Regardless of what communication passed between the castle and the road, Meersburg spoke clearly to Vicarus. This was no paltry country monastery. The grandeur of the dwelling revealed itself more resplendently with every clip-clop of the hooves in front of him. Vicarus stared as the spires reached higher into the southern sky. His eyes and heart cooperated to lead the way, beckoned by what familiar comforts surely awaited him there. The wheels of the wagon tripled in loudness as the rural road gave way to the cobblestone of Meersburg. The hearts of Vicarus and the knights rose to meet that sound, thumping against their ribs with an excitement that Vicarus could not precisely explain. The cart rolled to a stop, while sunset colors decorated every wall, wagon, tree, and face willing to reflect its beauty. Vickers was the first to leap from the cart. He ran a few paces to a rickety old wooden bridge that crossed a stone ravine, the far side of which was made of the neatly laid rows of grey bricks that rose to support the walls of the castle facade. To his right were more rows of brick, extending outward and upward, the extremities of which slyly ducked behind the growing darkness. To his left was a sight both foreign and magnificent. Framed on the right side by the edge of the castle, and on the left by a cluster of tall pines, was a swath of shimmering Lake Constance, reflecting the orange of the sunset back to the sky with gleeful gratitude. Vickers had never imagined such an expanse of water. He squinted his eyes to make out in the deep distance the faded outline of the opposite shore. 1,000 nautical fantasies spurred into action in his head as the brilliant orange struck the back of his eyes. The lake, the sunset, and the fantasies all lost Vickers' attention to a booming voice on the other side of the rickety bridge. A large, broad figure stood under the arched entrance to the castle, too shrouded by the castle's shadow to reveal any details. But the voice was rich and oily, diverse and apparently on good terms with the air that divided them, for the air carried the voice to Vickers' ears with pride and alacrity. Above the man, mounted on the wall atop the archway, was a large crucifix. The figure of Christ on the cross stood only barely shorter than Vickers' mother, and lent a divine credibility to the savory voice that welcomed them to Meersburg. The grand silhouette from which the jovial greeting came was more enticing than the dining room of Castle Tannhäuser on Christmas Eve. The figure rolled back and forth from right leg to left, pleasantly lumbering across the bridge. Vickers moved forward at the same pace, but gracefully, with silent boots that barely touched the old wood beneath them, relieved of half of their weight by a light and eager heart. The large man was not like Baron Luitpold or Vickers' brothers, or even like the honored Alovich. He was unlike any man Vickers had ever encountered. They met in the center of the bridge, where proximity revealed a round face, incongruently youthful, almost boyish, beneath the rolling gray locks of hair that capped it. A thin gray beard hung from the man's bubble of a chin, with a narrow string of his previous black just to the left of the center, seeming to dangle freely from the gray hairs around it as he spoke, like the tail of a jubilant dog seeing its good master. "Luitpold Vickers von Tannhäuser," the man belted from his abundant, richly red lips. "You honor these old eyes with beauty that could only have come from your mother's womb." With the mention of Matilda's, a sparkle in the man's happy eyes and a tilt of his stately head betrayed an intimate tenderness, an undeniable adoration held in those twinkling eyes for Vickers' beloved mother. If the expanse of orange water, and the life-size crucifix, the splendid old castle, and the rich voice of its proprietor were not enough to cradle and suckle our young hero's heart, this obvious connection to his mother would alone have seduced him to throw himself at the large round feet of the man before him. Vickers had no time to do so. No sooner had his heart been pulled into the man's embrace than a pair of remarkably powerful arms enveloped his stout frame and submerged him into the breast of his host. The man shook Vickers, hummed a tune unrecognized by his young guest, and kissed the boy repeatedly on the crown of his head. This must have seemed odd, even unsettling to a stranger in these unfamiliar surroundings, but familiar warmth and paternal care shone from the deepest parts of that thick chest and heated Vickers inside and out. The man released Vickers and gestured toward the others. Vickers turned to follow the man's hands, where the old priest stood with open jaw at the unexpected familiarity and warmth on display in the center of the rickety bridge. The knights squeezed around the lord of the castle, passing him on either side with a smile and a hearty pat on the man's shoulders. They disappeared behind the girthy obstruction, who still stood gesturing to the priest. "Stefan," the rich, oily voice boomed forward. "Come introduce this poor boy to his oldest family friend." The priest responded to the command. He walked to the center of the bridge, placed one hand on Vickers' shoulder with shocking tenderness, and spoke. "Luitpold, this is Count Conradin von Buchhorn. We are to be his guests tonight." He turned to the count and confirmed. "It appears, old friend, that I need not tell you of young Luitpold von Tannhäuser." "No, father, I know well of young Luitpold." Vickers hesitatingly interrupted. "I prefer to be called—" Yes, Vickers," the count laughed. "Of course you choose the name your lovely mother gave you." As he stared into Vickers' eyes, the count's face turned grave. His gaze seemed to penetrate far beyond what his eyes could naturally see. The silent pause that followed seemed an eternity to Vickers. Finally, a chuckle shattered the frozen moment and pulled from deep in the count's throat. "You have your mother's eyes in that skull of yours. I feel for a moment that I stood in front of her years ago in her father's fields, instead of here and now at my own home. My boy, you are welcome here. While you are within my walls, this castle and all within it are to be considered yours." With those words, Vicarus's image in the eyes of the priest completed its drastic transition from the spoiled, useless adolescent that broke his mother's embrace to mount the cart in front of Castle Tannhäuser, to a figure of almost mystical intrigue just a few days later. The Count took Vicarus by the hand, swallowing him from fingertip to wrist in a tight grip, and pulled the boy through the archway that led into the castle, as if stout young Vicarus was but a scarf in his hand. The priest followed behind with a curious but delighted grin that Vicarus was unable to look back and witness. It would not be the last such expression the wrinkled priest would pass to the youngest Tannhäuser. What happened to his travelling companions Vicarus could not say. The Count whisked him away with much more agility than a man of his age and girth should have been able. Beyond the castle door was a foyer, lit just dimly by the lights from the hallway ahead and by the weak dusk light from the courtyard to his right. Fully lit, there would have been little more to see. The foyer was grey and dingy, the floors were dirty cobblestone. It seemed to Vicarus that his boots scraped more dirt and sand than stone. The courtyard was framed by a tremendous, thick, bold proscenium arch that stood as a mystical barrier between the archaic foyer and the heavenly garden beyond. In the foyer, directly across from the castle entrance, was another oversized crucifix, with statues of feminine figures on either side, like prayerful bookends. The Christ figure on the cross towered over the castle's guests, but this is not what froze the young Tannhäuser in a fixed gaze. Unlike the crucifix outside the castle, weather-worn and undistinguished beyond its size, this crucifix captivated with extraordinary realism. The flesh of Christ was painted so vividly that it looked as if it could have been pinched and lifted from the body, rather than hardened oils on hardened wood. The bruises on the knees, the droplets of blood from the thorny crown, which ran down the cheeks and gathered in droplets at the ridge of the jaw, the wincing expression, conveying great anguish and understanding, mourning and hope, all worked in unison to give the viewer the distinct sensation that time held still while the precise moment of the crucifixion of Christ stood on display in the dark, dirty foyer of Meersburg Castle. Vicarus resisted the pull of the Count as he continued to stare at the crucifix, expecting the release of its held breath and the flow of its blood to resume. Of course it did not, and Vicarus yielded to the insistent tug of the Count's meaty hand. Jutting out from the wall, to the left of the crucifix, was a small mounted fountain. The Count indicated its purpose when he dipped his right hand into its shallow supply and made the sign of the cross. Vicarus, whose right hand was not under his own control, twisted behind himself as they passed the fountain, trying to reach his left hand for the water, but he was pulled too quickly through the stone arches that ribbed the hallway ceiling like vertebrae. Vicarus could make no sense of the sudden expedience, particularly after a much more leisurely day of travel and the casual, familial greeting he received on the bridge. While he tried to compose an appropriately phrased question on that point, his curiosity was satiated. "How fortunate that you arrived this evening, my boy," the Count belted with an increased pace and a tighter squeeze of the much smaller hand within his. "For of every night in the long year, this is the one most celebrated in this castle." The mad rush of input into his senses and sensibilities had not pushed from young Tannhäuser's mind that this was his birthday, his 17th birthday. For a moment, he allowed his vanity to presume the purpose of the excitement and the need for haste. The thought was amended by the Count's following statement. "It is Martinstag, the feast of our beloved St. Martin, and Meersburg's oldest and most cherished tradition will welcome its newest practitioner." With that, the Count released Vicarus's hand and gave him a firm slap on the back, sending him 3 or 4 rapid steps forward to avoid finding himself belly down on the base of a rising stairwell. The stairs were welcoming, in stark contrast against the dirty floors. Each step was polished wood, deep brown brought to a reflective gleam. The walls were not old grey stone, but brilliant white, made brighter by copious mirrored sconces. A dozen candles lit the stairwell. At last, Vicarus thought, the castle matches its proprietor in richness and taste. The Count led Vicarus up the stairs to a corridor from which many rooms branched. Most were occupied. The castle was filled with honored guests for the celebration of St. Martin's Day. But one room was kept empty, kept for the son of Baroness Tannhäuser, Mathildus von Urach, the best room in the castle, except for the master's chamber. It was a southern room, with a large southern-facing window. The lateness of the day forbade Vicarus's eyes from witnessing what he knew would be a breathtaking view of the lake beyond, but his imagination paused to see what his senses could not. "So much your mother's son," the Count roared. shaking Vickers quite violently from his musings. "No time for that, son. The wardrobe is full. Choose whatever you like, but wear a cloak atop. You must wear a cloak. The evening depends upon it." He spoke the last word with a dynamic but playful growl in his voice before disappearing quickly from the doorway. His hearty footsteps echoed through the entire castle, masking from Vickers their position and direction of travel. Strange, it seemed to Vickers, this insistence upon a cloak. He travelled for 3 days and had rather hoped to remain indoors, at least through the night. But the necessity of a cloak suggested outdoor activities. The thought exhausted him, and he plopped upon the supple reception of the bed, with its ample folds of luxurious bedding. He allowed himself a few slow breaths, followed by a curt, forced sigh, before rising with determination to his feet. Vickers wanted badly to maintain this intimacy with his host, and would not jeopardize it by being late for the Martinstock festivities. He chose clothing most closely resembling those of the Count, and topped it with the richest, fur-lined cloak in the wardrobe. In the few minutes of his dressing, the most fantastically diverse wreath of aromas found its way through the arched hallways and across cobblestone floor and polished step into Vickers's room and to his eagerly accommodating nose. The humble meals of his last few days were but whiffs of air beside the feast that must have sent forth its cordial invitation in the form of that magnificent smell. There were meats, quite obviously a variety of meats, cooked in various methods, and the far subtler aroma of breads and beers rode stealthily upon the more dominant smells, only to pounce from their carriage in a brave attack on Vickers' senses. His eagerness to please the Count may have fueled his heart, but the smells that had so gloriously ransacked his nostrils took possession of his extremities, and his feet were clumsily, greedily, and ambitiously shuffling Vickers out of his bedroom. He had no idea in which direction the Count had gone, no concept of the layout of the castle, and no indication as to where and when he should join the Martinstock festivities. He did not wonder for long. Doors on both sides of his flung open, 1, 2, 3 at a time, from which other richly clothed guests, each pulling a lush cloak in their wake, poured out in jovial spirits. They seemed to know the way, like water knows the way from spring to sea, subconsciously, amid their conversations, but equally determined to reach their destination. Oh, what a happy, babbling little stream they were! Vickers's eyes stayed fixed on the backs of the heads in front of him, simply following and marking nothing in his mind for future reference, an oversight he would later regret. Up, down, left, and right, Vickers would have sworn that the herd of revelers traveled 7 times the length of all of the castle's corridors and hallways combined. But finally, their crammed passage opened to a grand dining hall. The water had reached the sea and dispersed into a new expanse, dispensing into small groups of 2, 3, or 4, except for a lone group of 1, Vickers, who once again felt like an observer of life, much more than a participant. End of chapter 6.